What's up everyone and welcome back to the Echoes of Time channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 16 facts about Julia Tyler, the 1800s most divisive First Lady. Julia Gardiner Tyler, the second wife of President John Tyler, came before the revolutionary Eleanor Roosevelt and the glitzy Jackie O. Julia Gardiner Tyler was strong, brash, and magnificent even though she became First Lady in the 1800s, a restrictive and terrible time for women. There was a lot of talk about Tyler's young bride's wild side, but Tyler controlled the headlines instead of allowing them control her life. Her lavish and spectacular lifestyle helped her establish herself as the first famous First Lady. In an era when ladies were supposed to be deeply modest, she was the antithesis of modesty. Julia Gardiner Tyler is regarded as one of the most scandalous First Ladies in history due to her wild stories. She was a powerful, self-reliant lady who followed her own desires. Given these details about Julia Gardiner Tyler's unusual existence, her narrative may be even more fascinating than her husband's. She posed scandalously in a handbag advertisement. Julia Gardiner was regarded as a highly gorgeous and vivacious young lady when she was younger. She was widely considered as a potential wife for societal bigwigs because she came from a wealthy Long Island family. However, in 1839, Gardiner made the wrong kind of news when she surreptitiously appeared in an advertising for a middle-class clothes store. At the time, it was unheard of and totally unacceptable for an upper-class woman to model in a newspaper advertisement. To protect her reputation, her parents took her to Europe. A secret admirer called her the Rose of Long Island. Gardiner's scandalous reputation was further enhanced when an anonymous person wrote an ode to her in the newspaper, earning her the moniker the Rose of Long Island. Once more, at the time, it was undesirable for a woman to be exposed in this way. It was basically the contemporary equivalent of having your nude photos stolen and posted online. She was a well-known flirt and had a slew of suitors. Prestigious men were always drawn to Gardiner despite her propensity for controversy. A German lord, a Belgian count, bachelor and future President James Buchanan, and future President Millard Fillmore were among the people she had romantic relationships with. Gardiner was competitive. Her father had to rent an additional room to accommodate the numerous suitors she and her sister Margaret attracted. Her reputation as a flirt enhanced her sex appeal. Her parents were apparently embarrassed by her clear signals to possible suitors that she was interested in them at the time, which was unprecedented. 4 years, she refused to wed John Tyler. Almost immediately after meeting Gardiner, President John Tyler fell in love with her. He even tried to kiss her by chasing her around the furnishings in the living room. 5 months after the death of his former wife, in 1843, he made his first proposal at the White House masquerade ball. Although Gardiner liked to flirt with the president, she thought he was too old for her because he was 30 years older than her. Despite his position, Tyler was an unpopular president who had just assumed office upon William Henry Harrison's passing. Her parents did not force her into the marriage because he was also not particularly wealthy. But Tyler remained unfazed and spent the following year publicly courting Gardiner and proposing to her. On board the USS Princeton, she survived an explosion. Along with the president and other prominent figures in Washington, Gardiner and her family witnessed the USS Princeton's christening in 1844. The ship had the biggest cannons ever constructed on a boat, and during the cruise, the guns were ceremoniously blasted. David Gardiner, Julia's father, was among the 6 people killed when one of these blasts misfired and exploded on the ship. Julia Gardiner, who was grieving over her father's passing, found warmth and support in John Tyler and eventually fell in love. In some versions of the narrative, at least. Her family's financial condition became unstable after David's death, and the marriage now provided her with the most secure way to keep her status. At first, she was drawn to John Tyler's son. Julia Gardiner had her eye on the president's son, John Tyler Jr., a charming flirt who wrote her poems, when the Gardiner family was first invited to supper at the White House. Even though he was married, she persisted in flirting with him for a while. Gardiner soon went on to greener, or rather, grayer pastures along the path of his father, despite his plans to divorce his wife. Gardiner first got to know the president as a potential daughter-in-law. She had a covert affair with the president. Imagine the outrage that would arise today if a sitting president who recently lost his wife secretly eloped with a woman 30 years his junior. That's precisely what occurred in 1844, and it makes sense that people went crazy. Tyler and his new bride justified their covert marriage by claiming to be grieving the loss of Gardiner's father. News of the event, which took place at the Church of the Ascension in New York with just 12 guests, spread almost instantly. Reactions were naturally mixed as large crowds flocked to see the newlyweds. John Tyler was 30 years older than her. Gardiner was 24 and Tyler was 54 when they were married in 1844. To put it in perspective, Tyler's first daughter was 5 years older than Gardiner, and her own mother was 9 years younger than Tyler. Tyler was charmed by her youth, but Gardiner was immediately repulsed by their age difference. She was a vivacious and wild pot-stirrer, while he was a quiet, conservative Southern man. It seems that opposites finally attracted. Her stepdaughters detested her. Not everyone was eager to board the Julia train, despite the intrigue surrounding the new First Lady. At first, John Tyler's 3 eldest daughters from his first marriage detested their new stepmother. They saw the abrupt marriage as a slight to their mother's memory, and Tyler had previously declared he had no intention of getting married again. Letitia Tyler never warmed up to Gardiner, but Mary and Elizabeth Tyler did. Gardiner, who had a strong emotional connection to Letitia's estranged husband, assumed hostess responsibilities that had previously been hers. In the White House, she adopted royal customs, such as having ladies in waiting. Julia Gardiner made the most of her brief, less than a year, tenure in the White House. Inspired by her stay in Europe, Julia took up a number of royal customs. Among them were her women-in-waiting, or what she referred to as her Vestal Virgins. When Queen Julia invited guests or conducted festivities, the group of women, all dressed in similar white dresses, encircled her. Julia herself referred to her tenure as First Lady as her auspicious reign and frequently wore ornate gowns and headpieces. She was the first First Lady to be photographed. Gardiner wanted everyone to know how attractive she was. She became the first famous First Lady by posing for oil paintings and having replicas of her likeness distributed and sold. She therefore happily posed in photographer Edward Anthony's studio when photography first became available. Even though she was the first First Lady to be shot, her image was not as widely shared or popular as her portraiture. This is thought to be because her art depicted her as plumper, which made her appear more attractive. In other words, Photoshop in its vintage form. She made arrangements for the newspaper to write only positive things about her. In addition to selling engraved reproductions of her face to the public, Gardiner essentially ghost-wrote newspaper pieces praising her beauty since she was so driven to become well-known. Gardiner agreed to give reporter F.W. Thompson of the New York Herald complete access to all of her social gatherings in exchange for his penning glowing articles on her parties, style, and appearance. Thompson did just that, referring to Gardiner as the presidentress or the president's bride and focusing more on her radiant beauty than her social life. These articles were so extravagant that it's probable that some of them were written as pro-Julia propaganda by Gardiner's brother, Thompson's close friend. She enjoyed making grand entrances and rode around in a coach with 8 Arabian horses. Mrs. Tyler was skilled at making an entrance and was never one for subtlety. She often traveled around Washington in a specialized carriage drawn by 8 white Arabian horses. She decided she needed an Italian greyhound to accompany her on her first public walk, so she acquired one from the consulate in Naples. In an attempt to guarantee a spectacular entrance with tons of attention, she even once arrived late to a ship christening at the naval yard. She inspired the naming of polka dances. Gardiner's passion for dancing was well known. She regularly hosted extravagant White House parties where attendees would pop bottles of champagne and perform the polka. Naturally, Gardiner had a reputation for dancing a little too close to anyone other than her husband, the president. She naturally accepted when requested for permission to use her name on the sheet music for the Julia waltzes and started spreading the word about it. She was an ardent Confederate. Gardiner had grown up in the lap of luxury despite coming from the North. Thus, as a Southern belle, she had no trouble settling into life on Tyler's Virginia estate following her time in the White House. Despite her lack of political involvement, Julia may have had a greater impact on the president than any previous First Lady. She was the first First Lady to feature in a political cartoon since she was a strong supporter of the annexation of Texas and had influence over Tyler and others in this regard. Even after her husband passed away in 1862, Gardiner remained a staunch supporter of the Confederacy. Regretfully, she also published an article in 1853 in response to British abolitionist women, endorsing slavery. The piece criticized Britain's duplicity over the practice and its involvement in American affairs rather than defending slavery. However, Gardiner probably didn't think slavery was ethically bad because she was raised with slave labor. She went temporarily insane. Gardiner had been living in the clouds for years, but the Civil War and her husband's passing forced her to face reality. She returned to her mother's house in Staten Island and had to sell her estate in Virginia due to growing debt. Despite her financial struggles, she maintained her connections in Washington and worked to improve her public persona by calling herself Mrs. Ex-President Tyler. She eventually succeeded in lobbying for federal employment for her 2 boys and a widow's pension for herself and future first ladies, enabling her to live comfortably for the 10 years leading up to her death in 1889. She was always a formidable force.